Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast for today. That's a little bit of pre-work for our class on genetics and genomics. We're going to go from a baseline to a little bit back to microbiology in this podcast. I'm Dr. Lori Westbury, your professor for the course, and in the right lower corner, you can see my professor avatar. So here we go. I call this the Genetics in Healthcare Boot Camp, Wrestling with Genetics and Genomics with Westbury. I always like to start with a thought of the day, and today's thought is, nothing in life is to be feared, it's only to be understood, and that's Marie Curie. This too, genome sequencing is not to be feared, okay? This is an exciting game-changing technology that's transforming healthcare. You're going to hear that comment several times during this whole course, right? We're talking about technology advancements. We're talking about AI that's aiding in clinical decision-making, right? We're talking too about how to use this safely and ethically. And we're going to go into a lot of that, both in this podcast and further when we proceed into some of our activities in the course. Patients are presenting to healthcare specialties and benefiting from the power of the genome. We're going to talk a lot about personalized medicine, personalized healthcare, personalized medication. Those are all words that are sometimes used universally, but they're very different aspects, right? So again, personalized healthcare is the term that I prefer because that means everybody in the healthcare team has a part in this, which is very true. Whereas personalized medicine, we think more of MD derivative or provider care. And again, we are all providers and we are all equal partners in genetics and genomics and utilizing some of the knowledge that we have from the power of genetics. Personalized medications are really changing, right? That's a real big aspect of what's going on. Drug labels are changing to include gene mutation information. We'll talk further about that, but those that maybe would not do well if you have a specific gene mutation, maybe you won't do so well in a particular using a particular med. Maybe you synthesize things a little bit differently, medications, etc. And these alerts are coming in our electronic medical administration record too, so in our EHR. About interfaces with genes, genetic incompatibilities, etc. We already talked about, and by the way, you'll hear me say G and G a lot of times for the sake of simplicity, but that is genetics and genomics, and I'll tell you the difference in just a minute. But we have a lot of gaps to bridge. Our consumers are sometimes coming to us with more knowledge than what we have in genetics and genomics, and that's a problem, right? We have different communication strategies too that we need to, different language, so to say, when we're addressing risk perceptive behaviors in practice, when we're discussing terminology in genetics and genomics. I'm going to give you an example now that is the last bullet point on here. Many times we hear individuals talk about, I have the BRCA gene for breast cancer, whether it's BRCA1, BRCA2, both. Technically, we all have copies of that gene, okay? But do we carry a mutated gene, okay? Do we have a mutation upon one of those genes? That's where the language differences in the communication really need to be started from. And we're going to talk about a lot of that today, and we're going to go back to microbiology and have a little boot camp on that too. But that is where we have to have different communication strategies. In class, you're going to have a different communication level of discussing some of the questions that a particular patient might have regarding their genetic composition after they get genetic testing. Again, in nursing, we're responsible for interpreting some of these, all of these things that are coming towards us by our patients, just like we do in everything else with answering questions. So on the screen, I have sort of the difference between genetics and genomics. I won't read this verbatim. It's on the screen. You will also have a separate copy of this PowerPoint as well without the podcast. But I just want you to understand that genetics is to the right, genomics is to the left. Genetics, for simplicity speaking, is the study of the function and composition of single genes. Genomics is sort of the complete genetic information of an organism, and it's sort of that whole coding, right? And the non-coding of the DNA. So genomics is sort of that big umbrella, and the genetics is a little bit more of that single gene. Again, we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in just a second. So we'll go back into history quite a few times within here, but I'm going to really look more at nursing practice within this podcast. So again, there was in 2003, there was the Human Genome Project, which was the expansion of new knowledge and evidence that has the potential to impact nursing practice. Huge project, different elements within that, many projects since then too. I'm just going to highlight a few in this podcast. But where do we come in as a nursing practice? Well, the ANA in 2002 also had a position statement, okay, that leaders in nursing integrate genetic knowledge and skills at all levels of professional practice. And we sort of had the emergence and rapid developments have happened, and they really wanted to personalize nursing. And I'm not going to read this verbatim to you, but what does that mean to us? Well, we know that there's gaps. You all are getting a lot of genomics and genetics information within the technology course. What's happened in the past? You might have had a little bit of a sprinkling of genetics and genomics. Maybe you had some in OB and PEDS. Maybe it's been several years. Maybe you didn't have that. Maybe you've been in you've been in nursing for a very long time, and maybe coming back to school now, and now you're coming back to that. Yes, did you have it in your pre-nursing prerequisites, so to say? Yeah, you had a lot in microbiology, but was it nursing specific? And we know that the answer is no to that. And there's been so many advancements now. But again, since 2002, there's been a call to put this into nursing education so that the transition to healthcare practice was that much better. But that hasn't happened, right? Or it's happening at very different levels, right? So we need to have this education to maximize technologies and knowledge that are going to benefit patient outcomes, right? And so again, leadership in this, how do we really bridge this gap of implementation of this science to the application to our clients towards better outcomes? So I've put a lot of facts on here, from definitions to consumer engagement. And we know that consumer engagement is so very important, right? And there's safeties that go with that, right? And what I really want to focus as you're reading this slide here as I'm speaking is really that this is an era of personalized medicine. Again, you know that I like personalized healthcare. But I really want to focus in on the bullet point that says personalized genomic information can help change treatment from interventional to preventative. We know that's a huge focus, right? That we're trying to focus more on preventative, sort of minimize readmissions, whether it's clinical cases or it's using genetics for this preventative basis as people, more and more of our clients are getting genetic testing, right? So what can we do? And so this is what we're going to focus on within this course and within our podcast today. So you all have heard a lot about the AACN essentials. You've worked upon those in school. You've heard a lot about that. But what I really want to talk about on this slide is that in our old essentials, okay, whether it's 2008, 2009 in the domains, and now we're in the 2021 domains, there's a little bit of a difference. So in the old essentials, genetics and genomics was referred to briefly in patient-centered care, right? And now it's still in patient-centered care, but it also has its own domain within informatics, sort of as the umbrella. Naturally, we saw fit at EU to put it in under this technology and informatics course that we have, really as an umbrella of knowledge. And again, you're going to have this in other courses as well, but this is to really solidify some of this basic knowledge in this course. And I did put sort of the responsibilities that are on there as the ANA has seen in the essentials of genetic and genomic nursing. And this goes with what I just said as well. In other words, there's some essentials of genomic nursing that the ANA has come out with. I will show you some of those competencies within this podcast as well, and we'll talk about that. We cannot omit the ANA Code of Ethics as well. Okay? Yes, we've talked about the essentials and where that lays in, but I really want to talk to you about the Code of Ethics throughout this podcast as well, because it really is a huge part within genetics and genomics as well. We've talked too that we've had a sprinkling of this information, but collectively we have to be prepared. We have educated consumers coming to us for guidance and assistance, but do we know how to answer their questions? In just a bit, we're going to talk about genomics in a little bit more of, remember that microbiology background. We're going to talk a little bit more of kind of that proper terminology and what exactly happens. But something that I really want to bring up is that we cannot forget that there's genetics, but there's also environmental and modifiable factors such as diet, exercise, pollutants that can impact further risk for these diseases or conditions or mutations that occur via environment. So again, we cannot forget that there are other things. I also want to really talk about the nurse's ability to take an accurate family history and recognize risks and opportunities, right? As we do these pedigrees, and our EHRs assist with this now. But when we have genetic testing involved too, and we can interpret different gene variants maybe that come up on genetic testing, are we accurately incorporating this on our family history and nursing history? Okay, yes, providers do this as well, but we know that we catch things sometimes that are maybe not on H&Ps or history taking or pedigrees of any point. So we need to understand this a little bit more as well. So with that topic, clinical decision-making, workflow, health information technology. That's what I labeled this at. And taking a family history, again, we said, there's a pedigree down there, and our EHRs really do this based on the things that we input, right? Or the provider inputs. And we'll talk a little bit more of what makes a really good pedigree and how many generations to go back. But I really want you to understand too that this is, we're assisting and we're allowing our patients to have this information, right? Where do they pass this information on to? What is the inheritance pattern? And we'll talk a little bit back about Punnett squares and dominant versus recessive in just a little bit as well. So I would be really not being transparent if I said that we have had quite a bit of time with addressing let me rephrase this. We've had bias in the way that we work with pedigrees, right? How we put certain diagrams to traditional male and female. And we're going to do an exercise in class or as part of your module with use of symbols and modern times. And I say modern times because again, we have non-binary genders, we have transgender, associations. So what do we do and how do we make a proper pedigree that does not involve bias? And again, I'm going to hold that until we do our class activity. But this is really important. And I want you thinking later when we do this activity, have our EHRs caught up with this? In other words, do they have traditional symbol use, or are we putting this nomenclature into our EHRs? So again, just something to think about. I won't take a lot of time, but I also want you thinking too, when we're taking a history, are we using non-judgmental questions? And I want you to think about that because I think a lot of times in our EHRs might be a basic history taking sort of template, right? Are we incorporating these things? Are we using non-judgmental questions? Take a look at these. See if you're using that. Are we still talking husband and wife instead of saying spouse or significant other? Are we talking about, are we using things like, are you married? Are you living with anyone? What is our terminology? So think about that. So I talked about personalized healthcare, personalized medicine, personalized medical care. This is another thing, kind of equating terminology, precision health. I want you to think about that for a minute. Yes, I put a definition down there about tailored patient care based on an individual's genomic or other omics, you'll hear omics, right? Clinical, physiological, lifestyle, behavioral, and environmental characteristics. I personally really like this definition because it incorporates sort of everything, not just genomics, but yes, including genomics and genetics. Precision health. What does that make you think, saying precision health? Kind of exact, maybe? Precise? So think about what that means to you and where we're going with that terminology. So these are two elements we're going to talk more as we further go on after we do a little bit of background in boot camp, so to say. But many people are volunteering to get their genomic material, their genetics, genetic testing sequenced so we can learn more about health and disease. Okay? There's risks with that, right? And we'll talk more about that as we go along. I'm in a project that, the All of Me project, which you can Google that and you can become a part of as well. But I decided to do that to find out a little bit more about my background, but also to help others. But again, that comes with risks, right? Because we're not really sure where all this information is. And if the information can either be obtained by other parties or security breaches. And this course is talking a lot about that, whether it's cybersecurity in organizations or it's material and data being extruded from cyber criminals or by other third parties, right? And so again, this course will talk more about that, but again, you can volunteer to be part of something like this. Pharmacogenetics, we're going to talk more about too, and we started to talk about that, right? Those specifics that maybe we can effectively see mutations that maybe somebody won't respond to particular medications, or we can minimize side effects by basing genetic code to particular medication. So again, we're going to talk more about that. I am not here to give information of, what's a good genetic testing site, what's the best. No, I'm not here. I just wanted to list a few of them down there. And you can see Genos, Veritas, 23andMe, there's Ancestry, right? But that is not really healthcare related. It's more where you're from and more of your background, so to say. But what I really want to sort of talk about is the first bullet point, which is GINA. And GINA actually was approved in 2008, but enacted in 2009. And that is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So what that means is that it keeps, I'm going to say, I'll use health insurance first. Health insurance can ask, have you ever had genetic testing? But they cannot deny you, because of GINA, to get covered. Now we're going to talk more about that in just a little bit, okay? Because there are some loopholes in that. But I want you to know that there is an act that is a non-discrimination act that's been around since, again, 2008/2009, that can protect you. And I say can protect you because it does, but there are some loopholes that we're going to discuss. So there are limitations to GINA, as I just said, and there's social implications and bias. I've put on the slide, and this is actually with the assistance of a colleague, but I just want you to understand too that there are some acquisitions to DNA testing and loopholes in there. It has been proven that healthcare and health insurance really is protected under this, but life insurance is not. Because that's a voluntary type of thing, and you can't go under GINA. So life insurance can ask you, have you ever had genetic testing? And if you say yes, they can deny you, based on maybe an assumption that it's going to, that they're going to have a bigger payout on some things in life insurance, okay? Again, that's voluntary, right? Also, there's a lot in the media, and I put like social issues. We'll come back to that in a minute, but there's a lot of articles saying genetic testing can hurt your chances of getting some types of insurance. Again, at the present time, I will say that most of the time it's life insurance and things like that, but can this change? And will GINA have to have further amendments to this act? And I think we understand that probably there has to be a little bit further. Something that was created in 2008, 2009 does have to have updates. And we know that in basically a lot of our federal acts in healthcare and politics, etc. There's a lot of social issues too, okay? And I put, for anybody familiar with the TLC show 90 Day Fiancé, there's a particular character or a person on that has Tourette's syndrome. And we know that sometimes there's a stigma with some of our genetic conditions, right? And maybe it's misinterpreted, right? Maybe we say, oh, that one looks like she's drug addicted, or, behaving badly, or, drunk, something like that. So we also know that the perceptions too. This particular couple was thinking about having kids, and they had some issues about what's going to happen in future generations. So again, we see these social issues on TV, we see it in film, and we're talking about that in a minute. But what kind of privacy do we have, and what about when we do disclose things? So these are things to think about. There's no perfect answer to this yet, because we know that we are addressing things as they appear. We'll further talk about this in class and in some of the literature you'll read too. But again, are we reimbursed for testing? Where can testing happen? Testing can happen in a hospital. It can be referred to from your provider. There might be coverage. We'll talk a little bit further about that. There might be third-party sharing. You might be sharing your results with your provider as you did a direct-to-consumer testing. Those would be those 23andMe, Veritas, et cetera, that I showed you. Those testings have decreased in cost. They can be from $100 to a couple $100 now. Hospital testing, if you're not reimbursed, or even if your insurance covers, can be a little bit more expensive, and can be a little bit more detailed too, and that can be up to a couple $1,000s. And we already talked about life insurance denials, or asking that question if you've ever had genetic testing. I encourage you to, if you want to know more about GINA, and I put some things, and we might even do an activity in class, but you can find that there are GINA violations. And I just wanted you to know that if that interests you, you can look at that. And yes, as I said, we have a lot of genetics and genomics in movies. I've listed some of them there. It can be genetics and genomics, ethical dilemmas, maybe towards genetics and genomics, healthcare realities, and access and injustice. It says access and justice, but we might term that injustice. And there's just a list of some of those. Even The Simpsons did a little bit of a GMO episode with the, by the way, GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and it was titled The Man Who Grew Too Much, and so you can even Google any of these. You're going to hear the terms ELSI or FELSI, okay? I've put a sort of a diagram of a FELSI, and that would be financial, ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics and genomics, okay? And this one has Turner syndrome, just a little, quip about that. Sometimes financial isn't we don't look at that. We only look at the ethical, legal, social aspects of that. But I do want you to understand that there is a financial, okay? And on this one, I put who pays for lifelong care. And that's something to think about. That is not universal, and that is not without injustice and biases in certain circumstances as well. But I just wanted you to understand what this terminology means when you hear it. We've already talked a little bit about the Human Genome Project. We've talked about GINA. There's more information on there, but I also really wanted you to be highlighted into the ANA Code of Ethics that really addresses genomics and the application of genomics in nursing practice. And they really bring up that ELSI aspect, okay? And again, I gave you a little bit more information about that. When you hear about genetics and genomics, a lot of times we really sort of focus in on tumor profiling and biomarkers. And so those definitions are on there too. Again, there's so much more than that. But in those two aspects too, we might have had some experience when it is about certain forms of chemo, maybe that targets certain therapies for a particular cancer or tumor, right? I also do want you thinking, as we just talked about FELSI, I want you thinking financially too, because sometimes we really see that there's certain therapy and chemotherapy that is specific to that type of tumor or that type of cancer, but we have insurances that deny paying for that, even though it says it's the best for the better prognosis and outcomes. As nurses, as healthcare in general, practitioners, where does that put us when we know that there's something better and more specific to that particular gene, but it's not going to be reimbursed? And patients are at the framework of, what do we do? What can we afford? And do we risk potential using something else because it's covered when it might not have the same prognosis? And that is a real ethical dilemma that we're in. And so I've listed here just some categories, right? Categories of genetics and genomic study, and we've talked about some of this already, right? And again, we've really, I hope I've accentuated the ethical decision making that we and our patients are in. Again, not knowing necessarily what the right answers are to all this, but how do we navigate it? How do we guide our clients? And how do we also have some resilience in what we do, in how we have to deal with these things as well, and how we're guiding, but do we always have optimal outcomes as we're guiding? So because this podcast is going to be a little bit lengthy, I want you to stop for a minute. I want you to reflect for a minute, and I want you to just look at these questions, right? Have you had a patient with Down syndrome? Have you ever passed meds now that have a pharmacogenetic warning on them? Have you already cared for a patient that's been referred with genetic testing? Do they need some information? Yes, we're going to do some activities in this course, but maybe you've already had some of this experience. So I want you to reflect, and I want you to gather your thoughts at this point. So a colleague of mine has, we're in a grant together, and they sort of put together like some of our hot go-to G&G topics, right? And so I'll let you look at those. We know that there's, as we hear of, designer children, right? Using genetics and manipulating genetics towards these kind of designer babies, and how we have GMOs for foods, right? We're kind of manipulating organisms in foods, and we already talked about direct-to-consumer testing being at a high right now. How are we using stem cells and gene-based therapies? So just something to sort of look at, and these are our hot go-to topics right now. So we've talked a little bit about bias in the pedigree, right? And how we put genders, beyond male, female, etc. Let's talk a little bit too about disparity in general in genomics and health equity, right? So sequencing still remains an expensive clinical tool. I said that some of the, testing now is a couple $100, which some might think it is much less than it was, but that's still prohibiting, right? Or maybe the therapies that are associated with particular genes are extremely costly, and that's still true, very costly, right? So these expenses are exacerbating what's already inequities in our healthcare system, right? So are we also widening now by the scarcity of genomic data generated from people of diverse ancestries, diverse races? And the answer is yes, right? So we are maybe having genetic data from a particular section of the population without having it very diverse. Yes, these volunteering into, like I said, the all of me and some of these genetic bases. Again, you are volunteering your genetic material for free, but is that diverse? So again, we don't know. And again, for those that are paying to get testing and things like that, it might be from strictly, some populations without diversity. So the next several slides are really what the ANA, and updated in 2023, is really looking for indicators for nursing assessment and integrating genomic knowledge mostly into, again, the essentials and into competencies in education. So obviously we're doing a lot of these within our course, but it's how do we put it into practice? And I won't go through all of these verbatim now because hopefully the activities that we're incorporating into this course are going to put all of these into here, or that knowledge, that general broad knowledge. And then you will take that into your practices. Again, a lot of it is a basic understanding. It's collecting a family history. It's doing your physical assessment. So it's things you do already as nurses, things we do or will do as nurses. But how do we really incorporate more of the genetics and the genomics aspect? And so again, these several slides here really put these competencies into sort of bullet points and put a little bit of a framework for you in there.